He came to tear down an old building, but 5 children standing in the rubble stopped him with one sentence: "We have nowhere else to go." What he did next wasn't in any blueprint. The morning began like most others for James West, CEO of one of the most powerful development firms in the city. His office, perched high above the skyline on the 20th floor of a glass and steel tower, was soaked in golden light as the sun rose beyond the distant hills. Everything about the space was designed to assert control: sleek furniture, polished stone, and floor-to-ceiling windows that gave the illusion he stood above the world. He was reviewing final updates on a massive office complex project when his assistant knocked and entered, holding her phone out with a tense expression. "It's from the site," she said. "They're having a problem." James raised an eyebrow, mildly irritated. This was supposed to be the final day of demolition. The old structure had stood far too long, a crumbling holdover from a forgotten era of brick tenements and low-income housing, smack in the way of his company's next landmark development. Everything had been approved, permits signed, contractors briefed, payouts settled. It was meant to be routine. Clean. Efficient. He took the call with a sigh. On the other end, the site foreman sounded flustered. "Mr. West, we've got an issue down here. There are children. 5 of them. They won't move from the house. We tried calling social services, but..." James cut him off. "Children? What do you mean there are children?" "They're living there, sir. Apparently. We don't know how. But they won't leave, and the crew's refusing to go ahead with them in the way." There was a long silence. James pinched the bridge of his nose and stared out the window. "I'm on my way." He didn't often go to sites himself anymore, not for something like this. His presence was usually reserved for ribbon cuttings or investor tours. But something in the foreman's voice unsettled him. Children. Alone. Still in the house, despite everything. That wasn't just an inconvenience. That was something else entirely. 30 minutes later, James stepped out of his sleek black sedan onto the crumbling sidewalk in front of the old building. It stood hunched and weather-beaten, surrounded by scaffolding and heavy machinery. Yellow tape flapped gently in the wind. The neighborhood around it had already begun to change, newer developments rising like glass mountains around a forgotten valley. This house, however, was the last shadow of what used to be. But it wasn't empty. Standing at the base of the front steps were 5 children. 2 boys, one who looked about 10 with dark brown hair and protective eyes, and another, smaller, probably 8, blonde and clearly nervous. Beside them stood 3 identical girls, no older than 5, with matching blonde curls and wide, unblinking blue eyes. They weren't crying. They weren't running. They just stood there like they had been waiting for someone to come and try to take away what little they had left. James approached slowly, his light blue suit immaculate, his dark brown hair combed neatly into place, his expression unreadable. He stopped just short of the children, hands at his sides. "We need to demolish this building today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can't stay here." The oldest boy didn't flinch. He took a step forward and said, "Sir, we have nowhere else to go." That one sentence cut through James like cold water. He hadn't expected it to hit him the way it did. His first instinct was disbelief. How could they possibly still be here? Where were their parents? Why hadn't someone stepped in? He glanced around. No adults. No signs of supervision. Just these 5 small figures guarding a collapsing house like it was a castle. "What do you mean you have nowhere to go?" James asked, his voice lower now. The boy hesitated, then explained. "Our mom's in the hospital. She's really sick. Our dad, he left. He signed the papers and took the money, but he never came back. This is our home." James stood still, absorbing the words. No one had told him about children. No one had mentioned a mother in critical condition or a father who had abandoned his family. The payout had been processed. The signature was valid. And yet here stood 5 children, holding their ground with nothing but truth. He didn't know what to say. He looked into the eyes of the littlest girl. Her lip was trembling slightly, but she didn't speak. She just clutched the hand of one of her sisters tightly, as if she knew that even speaking might cost them the only place they had left. James West, who had negotiated multi-billion-dollar deals, stood silent in front of 5 children and felt powerless for the first time in years. Something shifted inside him, something he didn't yet understand. He stepped back, pulled out his phone, and called off the demolition. No one would touch this building until he figured out exactly what was happening. What he didn't yet know was that this encounter would change his life more than any boardroom ever had. And that these children, these 5 strangers, were about to become the most important part of his future. James didn't return to his office that day. Instead, he stayed near the site, seated inside his car with the engine off and the windows rolled down, the distant sounds of construction workers murmuring in the background. He couldn't stop replaying the boy's voice in his head, calm, measured, honest. "Sir, we have nowhere else to go." It wasn't defiant. It wasn't begging. It was simply true. That truth had stripped James of his usual certainty, unraveling his confidence like a thread pulled from a finely tailored suit. For a man used to data, blueprints, and precise decisions, this situation was uncharted territory. You couldn't negotiate with reality when children were involved. He asked his assistant to call off any remaining meetings for the day and requested a full background report on the property, not the legal version, which he already knew, but the human one. Who lived there before the demolition was approved? What were their names? Where were they supposed to go? He needed more than paperwork. He needed answers that couldn't be summarized in a line item. Then, against his usual instincts, he stepped out of the car and returned to the house. The children were still there, sitting now on the steps, huddled close. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the broken porch in soft gold. As he approached, the older boy stood again. James noted how protective he was, positioning himself instinctively in front of the younger ones. The boy had maturity in his eyes, the kind that came too early and cost too much. "What's your name?" James asked, this time gentler. The boy hesitated, then said, "Caleb." James nodded. "And the others?" Caleb glanced back. "That's Noah," he said, pointing to the blond boy. "He's my little brother. The girls are Lily, Lila, and Lucy. They're 5. Our little sisters." James blinked. Triplets. That explained the perfect symmetry between them. He looked at the children again, noticing the matching pale hair, the blue eyes that mirrored each other, and the way they all stayed so close they almost touched shoulders. He tried to picture them living here, finding food, bathing, getting dressed, going to sleep, without anyone watching over them. It was a reality he wasn't sure he could comprehend. "Who takes care of you?" James asked. Caleb looked down. "We take care of each other." The word sat in James's chest like a weight. "But what about your mom?" "She's in the hospital. She's really sick. She's been there a while." "And your father?" Caleb looked away. "He left. A few weeks ago. Said he'd come back, but he didn't." James exhaled slowly. He signed the demolition papers. Caleb nodded without looking up. "I know. I found the letter. He took the money." James was stunned by the bluntness of it all. These weren't just neglected children. They were abandoned, left to survive in a condemned house with no protection, no food security, no stability. And no one had noticed. Or worse, no one had cared. He sat down on the step beside Caleb, keeping a respectful distance. "Why didn't you call anyone?" "The police?" A teacher? Caleb shrugged. If we tell, they split us up. Foster homes. I read about it. We don't want that. We stay together. The three girls had crawled closer during the conversation, and one of them, Lily, he thought, leaned against Caleb's side and looked up at James. Are you gonna take our house? She asked. James looked into her small, serious face. Not today, he said quietly. No one's taking anything today. He spent the next hour with them. Listening. Asking careful questions. Piecing together the story of how they had survived, small acts of resourcefulness, the kindness of a neighbor who sometimes left groceries on the porch without asking questions, the money their mother had tucked away in a cookie tin that Caleb rationed with a discipline far beyond his years. It was clear to James that the kids weren't just surviving, they were holding on to one another with everything they had. When the sky turned purple and the streetlights flickered on, James stood to leave. He didn't want to. He felt like leaving would be an abandonment of its own, but he knew he needed to act carefully. There were legal processes, child welfare systems, and consequences to every move. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let them fall through the cracks. Before he left, Caleb spoke again. You're not like I thought you'd be, the boy said. James turned. How's that? I thought rich people wouldn't care. But you looked at us. You stayed. James didn't know how to respond. So he said the only thing that felt honest. Sometimes it takes meeting the right people to realize what you've been blind to. Caleb nodded solemnly, then turned and led his siblings back inside the house. James watched the door close behind them, and for a long moment, he stood on the broken sidewalk in silence. The city moved on around him, cars, streetlights, noise, but James West had just stepped into a world he never knew existed. And something deep inside him had already begun to change. The next morning, James arrived at his office earlier than usual. The city was just waking up, but his thoughts had been restless all night, tangled in the images of the 5 children on the crumbling steps of the house his company was supposed to demolish. He had spent hours going over everything, legalities, ethics, options, and nothing about the situation sat easily with him. For the first time in years, a decision couldn't be guided by logic alone. It was personal now, and no spreadsheet could help him untangle it. He called a private investigator he trusted and gave clear, urgent instructions: find out everything about the family. The next morning, James was in his office earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much. The image of the 5 children haunted him through the night, the way Caleb had stood between them like a soldier, the quiet strength in Noah's eyes, the delicate stillness of the 3 little girls. There was something about them that stirred a part of him he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility. Guilt. Maybe even something deeper, harder to name. He didn't tell anyone what had happened the day before. Not his legal team, not his board, not even the site foreman who had called him in the first place. He needed time to think. To understand what this meant. Because one thing was now very clear: demolishing that house, with or without those children inside, was no longer an option. He spent the morning making calls, quietly and deliberately. He contacted a private investigator he had used once during a corporate merger, someone discreet and meticulous, and gave him a name: the father of the children, listed on the demolition documents. He asked for everything. Where he had gone. What he had done with the payout. Whether there were any records of legal custody transfers. Then he called a family attorney, not his usual high-powered legal shark, but someone known for working with social services. Someone who understood the system and how to navigate it without shattering the lives of the people inside it. By noon, James had a growing file on his desk. The father, Michael Rayner, had taken the money and disappeared within 2 days of signing the papers. No forwarding address. No bank activity. No effort to check on the children. Technically, he hadn't committed a crime. The documents had been legal. But morally, ethically, James could barely stomach it. The mother, Evelyn Rayner, had been hospitalized for months due to an advanced autoimmune condition. There were no other known relatives listed in the system. The children had slipped through every crack. James leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, ghostly and sharp, framed by the city he helped build. He had spent most of his life rising above things, problems, people, places. He had used money to make issues disappear, contracts to create distance, and reputation to avoid questions. But this wasn't something he could buy his way out of. These were real lives. And something told him that if he didn't act, no one else would. That afternoon, he returned to the house. The demolition crew had long been dismissed, and the block was quiet. He brought groceries with him, nothing extravagant, just essentials: milk, cereal, fruit, bread, toothpaste, vitamins. When he knocked on the door, it took a moment before it opened. Caleb stood there, cautious but not unfriendly. He looked at the bags, then up at James. "You came back." "I said I would," James replied. Caleb let him in, and for the first time, James stepped across the threshold of the house. It was dim and worn, with old furniture, faded wallpaper, and the smell of something vaguely metallic. But it was clean. As clean as 5 children with no help could manage. The girls were coloring in the living room on a blanket laid out over the bare floorboards. Noah was reading a book too big for his age, sitting cross-legged in a corner. They all looked up when James entered but didn't speak. There was no fear in their eyes, just quiet curiosity. James set the bags down in the kitchen and asked if he could sit. Caleb nodded, and they talked again. This time, more deeply. About their routines. About what they ate when there was nothing left. About the neighbors who sometimes pretended not to see them. James didn't pry. He didn't press. He listened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt what it meant to be truly present for someone else. Then he asked the hardest question. "What do you want me to do?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at his siblings. At the drawings on the floor, the shoes lined up near the door, the ceiling where rain had started to leak again last week. "We just want to stay together," he finally said. "And we don't want to go back to him." James nodded slowly. "Would you trust me to help?" Caleb studied him. This was a boy who had been failed by adults more than once. But after a moment, he gave a small, tired nod. "Yeah. I think I would." That night, James made another call, to a friend who ran a pediatric outreach clinic. Then another, to someone he knew in city housing. Then, finally, to a woman he hadn't spoken to in years, his sister. Not to ask for help. Just to tell someone what he was doing. Just to say it out loud. For the first time in a long time, James West wasn't building something made of steel or glass. He was rebuilding a family. One step at a time. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, it felt more real than anything he'd done in his entire career. 2 days after his second visit to the house, James stood outside the Office of Child Protective Services, a folder tucked tightly under his arm and a knot of tension wound in his chest. It had been years since he had walked into a government building without a PR team, legal counsel, or security detail by his side. This time, he was just a man trying to help 5 children who had no one left. The night before, he had stayed up reading every line of policy he could find on emergency guardianship, family reunification, and the foster system's capacity limits. What he learned made him feel sick. The children had been lucky not to have been noticed by the system yet, because once they entered it, staying together would become a nearly impossible battle. Siblings, especially large sibling groups, were routinely separated, not from cruelty, but from logistics. There simply weren't enough families willing or able to take in 5 kids at once, especially when 3 of them were only 5 years old. He pushed the door open and walked into the modest waiting room, greeted by fluorescent lights and the sound of a crying toddler in the corner. A receptionist looked up as he approached, and he explained calmly that he wanted to speak with someone about an urgent child welfare situation. Within 20 minutes, he was sitting across from a social worker named Elena Morris. She was in her early 40s, wore no-nonsense glasses, and had an expression that told him she'd seen far more than she ever wanted to. She listened intently as he laid out the situation: 5 children, alone, surviving without adult supervision in a condemned home, their mother in the hospital, their father gone. He didn't try to impress her with credentials or wealth. He spoke plainly, truthfully, and with a growing sense of responsibility he hadn't even recognized as his own until recently. Elena raised a brow when he told her who he was. "You're the one who bought the land." James nodded. "I was. But I'm not moving forward with the project. Not until this is handled properly." She studied him, and for a moment he thought she was about to call his bluff. But instead, she opened a new file, jotted down the details, and said, "You know, this doesn't guarantee anything. Even if we confirm abandonment, even if we get emergency custody sorted, these kids could still end up in the system. Unless someone steps up." James didn't hesitate. "I'll step up." Elena froze for a second. "You want to foster them?" "I want to protect them. For now, whatever it takes. I'll hire the right people. Lawyers, caregivers. I don't need to be their father, at least not unless that's what's best for them, but I'm not letting them fall through the cracks." She nodded slowly, still watching him carefully. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. "Neither were they," James replied. Later that afternoon, an official welfare check was scheduled. Elena and another agent arrived with James at the house. The kids were startled but not frightened, and Caleb stood in front of his siblings the moment the car pulled up, his body tense and ready for battle. When Elena introduced herself and explained that they weren't there to take them away, Caleb didn't speak. He looked directly at James. James knelt down to his level and said, "I told you I'd help. I brought her so we can make sure no one else tries to take your home away." It was enough. Caleb stepped aside and let them in. The inspection was delicate. Elena asked questions, took notes, observed how the children interacted. James didn't interfere. He sat in the background, watching the way Lila twirled the hem of her dress when she was nervous, how Noah clutched the same book from before like it was armor, how Lucy kept glancing at the door as if waiting for something to go wrong. It made his heart ache. These were not just kids, they were survivors. Quietly brilliant, unbearably vulnerable, and carrying a strength far beyond their years. By the time the visit was over, Elena looked both moved and overwhelmed. She turned to James outside the house and said, "I'll fast-track an emergency hearing. We'll need temporary placement by the end of the week." "I'll be ready," he said. And he was. He called a child psychologist to schedule assessments, hired a private security team to watch the house discreetly at night, and arranged for a live-in nanny, not to replace anyone, but to give the kid someone familiar and consistent when he wasn't there. Juliana, the woman he had once dated briefly years ago and who had gone on to become a renowned child development expert, returned his call late that evening. She had once called him emotionally unreachable. Now she listened quietly as he explained everything, and when he finished, she said, "You're not the same man you were, are you?" "I hope not," he said. She agreed to meet the children. That night, James stood in the hallway of his penthouse apartment, looking at the extra room that had always been used for storage. For years, it had been filled with things he never needed. Now he wondered what it would feel like to hear footsteps running through that space, to hear laughter and shouting and life. He wasn't sure what would happen next. But for the first time in decades, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Not because it was smart. Not because it was profitable. But because it was right. And something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning of the emergency custody hearing arrived under a dull gray sky, as if the world itself was holding its breath. James sat in the back of the family court, dressed in a dark suit that, for once, didn't make him feel powerful. It felt heavy. His attorney, a soft-spoken but razor-sharp woman named Marlene Reyes, sat beside him reviewing documents with the precision of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart by technicalities. Across the aisle sat the state representative from Child Protective Services and Elena Morris, who gave James a small nod when their eyes met. He nodded back. In the row behind him were the children, accompanied by the live-in caretaker James had brought in just 2 days earlier. The girls wore matching yellow dresses, and the boys sat on either side of them like quiet sentinels. Caleb met James's gaze and gave a barely noticeable nod. It was the smallest sign of trust, but it steadied James more than any legal argument ever could. The judge entered, a tall woman with silver hair, a no-nonsense tone, and eyes that flicked across the courtroom like headlights on a dark road. She began by reviewing the case file, asking brief procedural questions, confirming the absence of the biological father, and acknowledging the hospital's official letter verifying that the children's mother, Evelyn Rayner, remained in critical care and unable to provide for them. Then she turned her attention to James. "You're requesting emergency guardianship over 5 children who are not related to you, Mr. West," she said evenly. "Why?" James stood slowly. He had prepared a statement, but in that moment, the papers in front of him felt hollow. Instead, he spoke from the truth he now carried like armor. "Because they were forgotten," he said. "Because no one else came for them. Because they deserve more than a system that would split them up and erase the only family they still have. I was the one who almost took their home. I signed the orders. But I didn't know who was still living there. When I met them, everything changed. Not just the project. Me." The judge narrowed her eyes. "You believe you're qualified to care for 5 children?" "No," James admitted. "Not alone. That's why I've assembled a support system. A licensed child psychologist. A certified caretaker. A private physician. And I've committed to doing whatever else is necessary, because this isn't a charity decision. It's a responsibility. One I didn't ask for, but one I've come to understand is mine." There was silence in the room. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. The judge looked down at the papers again, then asked Elena to speak. She gave a clear and thorough summary of the home visit, her observations of the children's condition, and James's behavior. "He didn't just bring groceries," she said. "He listened. He stayed. And when he didn't have the answer, he asked how to help. That's more than I see from a lot of biological parents." The hearing lasted another 40 minutes, filled with paperwork reviews, custody procedures, and legal definitions that James barely absorbed. He kept glancing back at the children, watching the way Lily leaned against Lila's shoulder, and how Lucy clutched a small stuffed rabbit she hadn't let go of since they arrived. When the judge finally returned with her ruling, her voice was clear and final. "Effective immediately, temporary guardianship of all 5 minors is awarded to Mr. James West, pending further evaluation within 60 days. James exhaled slowly, feeling a knot he didn't even know he'd been holding begin to loosen. The children didn't cheer or jump up. They didn't really understand what had happened. But Caleb turned and looked at James again, and this time, the nod was clearer. And with it came the faintest smile. After the hearing, James took the children out for lunch. It was a small diner, nothing fancy, just booths and chocolate milk and grilled cheese sandwiches. The girls talked more than they ever had before, asking questions, giggling among themselves, showing James the way they each liked to dip their fries in ketchup. Noah remained mostly quiet, but he sat beside James, and when the waitress brought over a coloring sheet, he slid it toward him. "You try," he said. James blinked, then laughed softly and picked up a crayon. That night, back at his apartment, he gave them a tour of their new temporary home. There were still boxes to unpack and furniture to arrange, but their rooms had been freshly painted, the sheets soft, and the walls decorated with bright decals of stars, animals, and flowers. The triplets each chose a bed without fighting. Caleb and Noah were placed in a room of their own, and James noticed the way Noah immediately began lining up his shoes and organizing his small stack of books. It struck him as such a grown-up thing for a child to do. Juliana stopped by just before bedtime to drop off some books and supplies she had promised. She spent a few minutes with each child, asking gentle questions and observing how they responded to their new surroundings. Then she pulled James aside. "They're scared," she said. "But they're already safer than they've been in months. Keep routines. Be patient. And let them come to you when they're ready." James nodded, and as she turned to leave, she said something that echoed in his mind long after the door closed. "You don't need to be perfect. Just present." Later that night, James stood alone in the hallway again, listening to the soft hum of the white noise machines he'd installed in each room. The apartment felt different now, less like a monument and more like a beginning. It still scared him, how much he didn't know, how far he had to go. But he also knew this, for the first time in years, he was exactly where he needed to be. And he wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. The first week with the children living in James's apartment was a delicate dance of learning and unlearning. Morning started earlier than they ever had in his adult life, not with alarms but with the soft shuffle of bare feet on hardwood and the sound of whispered voices from the hallway as the children tried to navigate a new space without waking him. But he was always already awake, sitting in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold, trying to anticipate what the day would bring. No amount of business negotiations or years in corporate leadership had prepared him for the daily chaos of getting 5 children dressed, fed, and out the door on time, especially when none of them yet trusted the rhythm of this new life. Caleb insisted on helping every morning. He made sure the girls had their backpacks ready, that Lucy remembered her sweater, and that Noah ate something other than toast. James tried not to hover, but he also didn't retreat. He helped when he could and stayed out of the way when he sensed they needed space. He learned quickly that the girls preferred their hair braided 3 different ways and that Noah hated milk in his cereal. He learned that Caleb couldn't relax until every door was locked and every light in the hall was off. These were the small rituals they had built for themselves in a life of uncertainty, and James didn't try to change them. He only tried to earn his way into them. The children had been enrolled in a nearby private school with a reputation for small class sizes and trauma-informed teachers. James worked with Juliana and the psychologist she recommended to ensure the transition was handled gently. There were quiet tears on the first day and nervous glances toward the classroom doors, but by the end of the week, all 5 had managed to settle in with some degree of comfort. James picked them up himself when he could, waiting just outside the gates in his car, watching as they emerged one by one, Caleb always first, scanning for threats even now, followed by Noah with his books clutched to his chest, and the girls who waved at nearly everyone they passed. At home, the evenings were a blend of chaos and calm. Dinner was loud, messy, and unpredictable. Some nights everyone was too tired to eat more than a few bites, and others they laughed so hard that James forgot he used to eat alone in silence. He brought in a professional chef to cook healthy meals, but the children made it clear they preferred his awkward attempts at grilled cheese and pancakes. So he learned to cook, not well, not quickly, but honestly. The process mattered more than the result. They established a nighttime routine that eventually began to feel sacred. The girls insisted on a bedtime story, but not from a book, they wanted one, from your head, as Lily explained. James found himself digging into old memories and half-remembered tales from his childhood, reimagining them with castles and forests and brave kids who always found their way home. Noah liked to fall asleep with music, soft instrumental songs he said helped keep the bad thoughts quiet. Caleb, more often than not, stayed up late reading or checking on the younger ones. One night, James found him in the hallway, sitting silently outside the girl's door. When asked why, Caleb shrugged and said, "They sleep better when they know someone's close." James nodded and didn't try to send him back to bed. He just sat next to him. One evening, about 2 weeks in, a call came from the hospital. Evelyn Rayner, the children's mother, had taken a sudden turn for the worse. James left immediately, letting the caretaker know where he was going and assuring the children that everything was okay. He arrived at the hospital to find Evelyn conscious but weak, her body diminished by illness, yet her eyes sharp with awareness. She recognized him immediately. "You're the one who saved them," she said softly. "I'm just trying to help," he replied. "No," she whispered. "You saw them. That's what saved them. No one saw them before." She told him about the years before her illness, about the slow unraveling of their lives, about Michael's descent into addiction and anger. Her voice trembled when she spoke of the moment she realized she could no longer protect her children, not with her body failing and the world closing in. "I thought if I could just stay alive long enough, I could come back for them," she said. James promised her that they were safe. That they were together. That he would not let them be taken from one another, no matter what. Evelyn cried silently. Then, gathering what little strength she had left, she asked him the one question he wasn't expecting. "Do they smile?" He nodded. "More every day." That night, when he returned home, James found a note taped to his bedroom door. It was written in colorful markers on notebook paper, each letter shaped with careful effort. "Thank you for letting us stay. We like it here. We think you're kind. Caleb, Noah, Lily, Lila, and Lucy." He read it twice, then folded it and slipped it into the top drawer of his desk. He knew then that he had crossed a threshold, not into fatherhood necessarily, but into a space where love begins. A space where responsibility is chosen, not inherited. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was just building things. He felt like he was becoming someone. Spring arrived quietly, with early sunlight filtering through the windows of James's apartment, casting long, golden lines across the floor where Lily had left her stuffed animals the night before. It had been just over a month since the children had moved in, and though their presence still brought a new kind of rhythm, one filled with early mornings, scattered crayons, forgotten lunchboxes, and whispered bedtime stories, it no longer felt unfamiliar. What once was an immaculate bachelor penthouse had transformed into a living, breathing home, full of laughter, spills, questions, and a strange but welcome sense of organized chaos. James had begun working from home more often. Meetings that once took place in boardrooms were now held via video calls from a small desk in his den, often interrupted by the soft thud of feet running past or a knock from one of the girls asking for help opening a juice box. Surprisingly, his business hadn't suffered. In fact, many of his clients and partners responded positively to his new energy. He spoke differently now, less polished, more grounded. His decisions felt more human. Investors noticed. So did the press. Word had spread of his unexpected guardianship, not through some PR campaign but through whispers, curious inquiries, and a few quiet photos taken as he walked hand in hand with the kids to a nearby park. He ignored the headlines. They didn't matter. What mattered was that Caleb had started smiling more freely. That Noah, once silent and guarded, now told James about the planets he loved and drew constellations with chalk on the balcony floor. That the girls had finally stopped waking in the middle of the night from nightmares. Lily had even started calling him Jay in a soft, affectionate voice that made his chest tighten every time. But the calm was disrupted one Tuesday morning when a letter arrived in a plain white envelope, addressed to James but with no return name. Inside was a single page. It was from Michael Rayner, the children's biological father. He was back in the city. He'd heard about the custody arrangement. And he wanted to meet. James didn't tell the kids right away. He brought the letter to Juliana and Elena first. Both were cautious, knowing how complex and dangerous reintroducing a parent could be, especially one who had abandoned his family and hadn't been in contact since the payout. But legally, Michael still had parental rights unless formally terminated. They had to proceed carefully. James agreed to a monitored meeting in a neutral location, a quiet office space provided by the family court. When the day came, James arrived early. He didn't know what he expected to feel. Anger, maybe. Disgust. But mostly, he felt protective. As if any wrong move could shatter the fragile safety the children had begun to trust. Michael arrived 15 minutes late. He looked different, thinner, older, his face marked by wear but his eyes still sharp with the kind of charm that had probably once worked on everyone but no longer fooled James. They shook hands stiffly and sat. Michael opened with small talk, which James ignored. Then he got to the point. He claimed he had entered a rehab program. That he had been clean for nearly 3 months. That he wanted to make amends, not necessarily to regain custody, but to be part of their lives again. He talked about regret, about realizing too late the damage he'd done, about feeling like he had nothing left except the hope that one day his kids might forgive him. James listened. He didn't interrupt. When Michael finished, James asked one question, "Why now?" Michael looked away. "Because I saw a photo in the paper. And they looked happy. Safer than they ever did with me. I thought I'd ruined them, but I guess I hoped I hadn't." James didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to say no, to shut this down and protect the children from more uncertainty. But he also knew that cutting someone out completely could leave questions that echoed forever. He told Michael that any future contact would be strictly controlled. That the children's emotional safety would come first. That any reintroduction would happen only if the professionals agreed it was in their best interest. Michael nodded. "Fair," he said. "It's more than I deserve." After the meeting, James went home and sat with Caleb on the back balcony. The boy had become more talkative in recent weeks, but now he sat quietly, hands resting on his knees, sensing that something was on James's mind. "I got a letter," James said gently. "From your father." Caleb didn't flinch. He just looked out at the sky. "He wants to see us, doesn't he?" James hesitated, then answered, "He says he's changed. That he wants to make things right." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "You don't have to decide anything now," James said. "And you don't have to see him if you don't want to. Nothing happens without your say." Caleb turned to him, eyes full of the kind of weight no child should have to carry. "I don't know if I want to forgive him. But I don't want to hate him either." James reached over and placed a hand gently on Caleb's shoulder. "That's more than fair." That night, when James tucked the girls into bed, Lucy wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Are we gonna have to go away?" James pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "No. You're not going anywhere. You're safe here. Always." And he meant it. Every word. Because no matter what came next, he would not let the children be hurt again. He had made them a promise, not just with words, but with every small action, every early morning, every story and meal and bedtime hug. They weren't his by blood. But they were his by choice. And that kind of bond, he had learned, was stronger than anything he had ever built before. Summer came slowly that year, as if the season itself understood that the family inside James West's once sterile apartment needed time to catch up to the warmth. The soft light poured through open windows, filling the home with a brightness that felt earned. It had been nearly 3 months since James had taken emergency guardianship of the 5 Rayner children, and though the walls still echoed with their voices and footsteps, the fear that had once clung to the air had been replaced by something stronger, something steadier. It was trust, not instant, not perfect, but real. The kind that grows in quiet rooms with stories whispered in the dark, in breakfasts cooked without being asked, in the way the children no longer jumped when a door closed too loudly. Legally, everything was still in progress. Custody wasn't yet permanent. The court wanted more time. Social workers made their scheduled visits. Psychologists submitted reports. But all signs pointed toward one truth: the children were thriving. Caleb had moved from quiet responsibility to gentle leadership. He'd made a friend at school, a boy who loved drawing comics, and together they started working on their own illustrated story. Noah, once buried under layers of silence, had joined a science club and stunned his teacher with a handmade solar system project. The triplets had blossomed into personalities so distinct that even strangers no longer mistook them for interchangeable. Lily liked adventure books. Lila preferred puzzles and patterns. Lucy, the most sensitive of the three, had taken to sitting near James whenever he worked, scribbling drawings or just watching him with calm, curious eyes. James had changed too. His colleagues noticed it first. The man who once demanded precision now practiced patience. He still cared about results, but not at the expense of people. He delegated more, listened longer, and even turned down a lucrative project overseas that would have kept him away for months. He no longer wanted to build empires. He wanted to build something closer. Something lasting. One Saturday morning, James took the kids on a short trip outside the city. They drove upstate to a small farm that allowed families to pick their own fruit and feed the animals. The air was clean, the sun soft, and the children's laughter echoed through open fields. It was the kind of day they would all remember, not because anything spectacular happened, but because nothing bad did. No surprises. No fear. Just space to be children. That afternoon, while the girls chased chickens and Noah tried to name every cloud shape, Caleb walked beside James through the orchard rows. The boy kicked at the dirt for a while before speaking. "If they ask us in court again, if they ask where we want to live," he hesitated. "Can we stay with you? Like forever?" James stopped walking. The question wasn't sudden, not really. It had been circling them for weeks, building in the looks, the hugs, the quiet attachments. But hearing it spoken aloud, direct, hopeful, scared, hit him harder than he expected. He crouched down so they were eye level. "Yes," James said. "If you want that, all of you. Then yes. I want you to stay with me. Forever." Caleb nodded, biting his lip. He was trying not to smile too much, trying to stay the calm protector he thought he needed to be. But the relief in his face gave everything away. A few days later, James filed for full legal custody. The court process moved more quickly than expected, in part because the biological father, Michael, formally relinquished his parental rights. He never pushed back, never tried to reclaim what he had lost. He simply signed the documents and left a final note. It wasn't dramatic or poetic. It simply said, "Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them they deserve better than me." James never showed them the letter. Instead, he gave them what he could. A stable home. Safety. A new last name, if they chose to take it. He told them they had the right to decide everything. To keep their mother's name. To visit her when she was well enough. To carry their history however they wanted. He wouldn't rewrite them. He would only walk beside them as they wrote the next chapter. On the day the adoption became final, James took them all out to dinner. It was the same diner they had gone to after the custody hearing, only this time the waitress remembered their names and brought out a cake at the end that said, "Family," in frosting. The girls squealed with delight. Noah smiled without hiding it. Caleb leaned back in his chair, finally letting himself relax. And James. James felt something he never had before. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was peace. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, he stood in the hallway between their rooms, listening to the soft hum of their breathing, the gentle rustle of blankets. He touched the wall, not for support, but for grounding. This wasn't the life he had built for himself. It was the life that had found him. And somehow, it was better than anything he had planned. Outside, the city lights blinked like distant stars. Inside, the quiet of a home filled with love settled into every corner. And for James West, the man who had once tried to demolish their house, the man who had walked into their lives as a stranger in a suit, it was the beginning of everything. The ending of this story resonates deeply because it doesn't rely on fantasy or perfection, it triumphs in its humanity. James West doesn't become a hero by saving the world, he becomes one by choosing to truly see the people in front of him, something he had never allowed himself to do before. His transformation isn't sudden or cinematic, it's slow, sometimes uncomfortable, and deeply personal. That's what makes it believable. What began as a story about power and demolition turns into one about healing, redemption, and the quiet courage it takes to change direction when you've lived your whole life moving the other way. The children, too, aren't just passive victims, they're resilient, cautious, smart, and brave in their own right. They teach James as much as he provides for them. The ending doesn't wrap everything into a bow, the scars remain, the past can't be erased, but the final image of them together, safe and laughing in a place they now call home, is exactly the kind of hope that feels earned. It's a reminder that sometimes, the greatest rebuild isn't made of steel or glass, but of love, accountability, and the promise that no one will be left behind again.